When we talk about building a story, one of the primary things that we focus on is obstacles. Those sorts of things that occur in the course of the story that require characters to respond in one way or another. And we often think of obstacles as simply things that get in the character's way. But I want to think of them as structural elements of the story, and also where obstacles come from and what they indicate about characters. So obstacles are the things that give shape to a story. They do this in a number of ways. First of all, they simply challenge the characters in internal and or external ways, force them to confront some idea of themselves, force them to, reach into their potential. There are all sorts of different ways this can manifest itself. But those challenges tell us about those characters. When we were talking about character in the previous talk, essentially what I was saying is that a character is only characterization until they meet some sort of challenge. And those challenges hearken transformations of some sort. And so the obstacles are points of transformation where characters might be confronted with something unexpected or unwanted or surprising in one way or another, and they're forced to adapt to it. And there are four primary ways that characters confront or approach or try to avoid the challenges that these obstacles place. The first of them is to try to pass through them, which is often seen as a symbol of a character's will or strength. So, for example, in the medieval romances, the knight will pass through the forest. And in doing so, they prove their valor, they prove their faith in the absence of God. In the dark night of the soul, they continue to believe that God will protect them, that sort of thing. The second way of responding is to try to go over or around whatever that challenge is rather than going through it. And this is often seen as a symbol of wit or cunning. In the story of the Odyssey, for example, Odysseus attempts to circumvent Charybdis, the whirlpool, as a way of avoiding it. So he uses cunning, he uses wit as a way of keeping his sailors safe, essentially. Of course, in the story, as we know, it doesn't quite work out. The third way that a character might confront or deal with an obstacle is to find another route, which is often seen as a symbol of wisdom or its opposite, maybe not opposite, but ancillary, cowardice. So, for example, in the mythic story of Columbus seeking a trade route to Asia, he finds what is referred to as the East Indies, right, which is the South American, North American continents. And that becomes another way, right? Rather than going the original route, he finds another way, or he finds another thing along the way. And the fourth way is to simply reject the premise that the obstacle places in front of the character. So, for example, if a political foe faces one, as in the story of Braveheart, where, the English imperial forces are seen as this kind of power that's held over the domain of the Scots. And Braveheart essentially defies them, right? He refuses their authority. Of course, in that story, he eventually dies as a result of that, but he dies as a martyr to a cause. And this is often seen as a symbol of nobility, or it's, again, ancillary delusion. What this comes down to is the relationship between obstacles and character psychology, which is one of the ways in which we sort of define modern storytelling. We become interested in the human psyche, right? That's how we differentiate between, say, Shakespeare and an ancient Greek writer like Aeschylus, for example, where Shakespeare is deeply interested in notions of the human psyche. And one of the things that we have to be cognizant of when we're thinking about that is the relationship between the external and internal obstacles, since these two things often run in tandem with each other. That we might be facing some sort of an external foe, a villain, a deadline, a choice, whatever. But in some ways it manifests something internally. So when St. George slays the dragon, it's a symbol of slaying sin, essentially, the inner demon, that kind of thing. It's just a manifestation of that idea. When we kill the monster in a monster story, what we're talking about essentially is subduing some internal fear, very often an irrational fear. The psychologist Adam Phillips has a lot to say about the psychology of obstacles in an essay of his called On Kissing, Tickling, and Being Bored that he published in 1993. And he talks about obstacles in a number of different ways, but sort of under the general heading of the fact that obstacles conceal and or reveal desires. In other words, they're not just things that we confront. They're things that, to a certain extent, we manifest, that they come from or they are an expression of something that is in us. And there's something that we often use to kind of cover up what we actually desire. So we're going after something and we're pretending as though it isn't us or it isn't something we desire because we don't want to sort of deal with that. And he refers to this as a kind of a necessary blind spot. Only through knowing what we think of as an obstacle can we understand our fantasies of continuity, he says. And the obstacle is a way of not letting something else happen. It's a necessary blind spot, right? He also talks about it being impossible to imagine desire without obstacles. Obstacles are what make desire possible. Freud talks about how desire is essentially fantasy, and fantasy is a construct that once realized becomes a nightmare. We always need to be holding it at arm's length. We always need to have a barrier between us and it, because the realization of our desires shows us that what we desire maybe isn't worth desiring or doesn't live up to our expectations. So we create these obstacles as a way of framing our desire. He also talks about how characters in fiction never know whether obstacles create desire or desire creates obstacles. In other words, the characters in the story seem to be, at least at some level, ignorant of the connection between the internal and the external, between the act of concealing and revealing what they desire. So what we end up with is a really complex engagement with human psychology in stories, where the obstacle is a manifestation of something, but it doesn't necessarily resolve it. It's simply a way for us to move in, for us to see, for us to locate what is at the core of that character, and then to figure out what sort of sense we want to make of that.